You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News, coming to you from Beijing. I'm your host, Tian Wei. A proposal designed to improve the distribution of incomes is expected to be unveiled at the end of this year. One of the key features will be an adjustment of primary distribution pattern, which is aimed at cutting taxes and encouraging enterprises to give more back to society in terms of financial resources. It will also encourage businesses to increase workers' salaries. So, what are the highlights and the challenges of implementing the income redistribution reforms? How will they influence China's economic structure and future economic development? And most importantly, will they achieve the goal of narrowing the widening wealth gap in China, something the Chinese government says is one of its top priorities? To discuss all of these questions and even more, we have Professor Yao Yang, Director of the Economic Research Center at Peking University. Welcome, sir. And also we're joined in the studio by David Mahon. He is the Chief Representative of Mahon China Investment Management. But before we go to a discussion, gentlemen, about this very, very important issue here in China, let's take a look at this background report.
China's microblogging community has been greatly concerned over the state of impoverished children across the country. Hunger, a lack of health care, education, and even proper clothing have left these young children with very few chances at having a normal, comfortable life. But on the other extreme, scandals involving the children of the newly rich have created anger and controversy across the country. One example includes Guo Mei, who falsely claimed to work at the Chinese Red Cross and came under scrutiny after she posted pictures of her lavish lifestyle online. Over the past few decades, China's income gap between rich and poor has widened, creating fears that this wealth inequality could lead to social instability. The Gini coefficient is commonly used to measure income inequality. Anything above 0.4 is considered to be nearing worrying levels. And according to a CIA estimate from 1989 to 2009, China's figure climbed to nearly 0.5. The figure in Western developed countries hovers around 0.3. After 8 years in the works, the Chinese government is expected to launch income distribution reforms by the end of this year. Economists say they may include a series of measures, including tax cuts, requirements that companies reinvest their profits back into society, and raising workers' wages. But they warn that strong entrenched interests may hinder any far-reaching reforms. At the 18th CPC National Congress, pledges were made to double the country's per capita income by 2020. To realize this goal, experts say the country must find new development models that increase the livelihood of the average citizen. Income distribution reform is just the first step in a long journey to make China a more equal society.
Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
The reform has been discussed, or rather the possibility of reform has been discussed back in the year 2004. 8 years already gone by. Why now, eventually this year, likely going to be a proposal? If there is going to be a proposal, how much change of a picture really is it going to make to the distribution of income here in this country? Professor Yao.
Well, I think there are several factors currently that induce the government to do this this year or next year. One of the factors is the rising inequality in China. By the early 2000s, the inequality was high, but was not very bad. But today, if you look at the Gini coefficient, it's approaching 0.5. Or even higher than that, some people say.
There is a standard of the Gini coefficient, which is how much and what does it mean now for China?
I think 0.4 can be a threshold. If it's below 0.4, then you would say, hey, this society is basically equal. But after 0.4, or even like China's case, approaching 0.5, then this country is entering a very unequal income distribution.
Right.
And another factor, I think, is the discussion of the middle income trap. So if you look at those countries that have been trapped in so-called income trap, middle income trap, none of them have very equal income distribution.
Right.
But if you look at the economies that have moved from middle income to high income, all of them have very equal income distribution. That is, the Gini coefficients are less than 0.4.
Mm-hmm. So these are possibly the reasons behind the timing. But as we understand, none of those points now being talked about in the possible proposal, which is like to come out within the year, are actually easy to be implemented, right, Mr. Mohammed?
Yeah, it's very difficult. The scale of China and its economy is such that any reforms of this type or policies that will give rise to reform require an enormous amount of focus, a great deal of money. And we can think of customs reform, which was a huge challenge to the Chinese government. But in the end, by reforming tariffs, by increasing the process of importing goods, the Chinese government made a fairer system, and there was an incentive for people to be more honest in that system. So I think that it's important that it should take place, but this is just the beginning.
It is just the beginning. One of those important points, though, Mr. Mohammed, you might have noticed, is about cutting taxes. Isn't that a popular phrase in our world today, particularly this year during an election year? And of course, the Chinese situation might be quite different from the situation in the others. Is it necessarily all about political popularity? That's not necessarily so, possibly. So, but cutting taxes sounds wonderful, but whose tax is going to be cut so that the distribution of income could be fairer? Are they going to cut the rich tax, or relatively the middle class if China has one now, or the relatively poorer population of the society?
I think they need to lower taxes on poorer individuals, definitely, and the lower middle class inhabitants of cities. But also they need to ensure that the tax system, corporate tax system, is more just. At the moment, the burden on small and medium-sized enterprises is considerable. And essentially it is an incentive to dodge tax. So across the board, tax reform needs to be refined to a great degree so actually people join the tax system and don't spend all their efforts trying to stay outside of it.
Help us to understand this, if I could just follow up a little bit for our viewers, particularly from overseas. Are those middle and small enterprises in China being taxed heavier than their bigger counterparts, or actually they enjoy the same tax rate? On the other hand, what might be the impact of the current taxes or tax rates on these enterprises, I mean the S&Ms?
I think essentially they are in aggregate more heavily taxed, because if you are a larger enterprise, even if you're a private company, your importance to your city, your importance to your region is much greater. And so as part of the incentives that government can give, you're encouraged to grow, you're a major employer, and you are, in a sense, an important tax resident. So they'll give you tax breaks, or the banks will give you money at far lower interest rates. So these things generally are not as widely available to privately owned small and medium-sized enterprises. And that in itself creates a number of problems for the economy.
Professor Yao, is that really the case? Whose tax is going to be cut? As a result, who's going to benefit? As a result, how is the reform proposal of the income distribution here in China?
First, I want to discuss a little bit about the tax burden between SMEs and the big companies. I think in general, I would say large firms pay more taxes. The only reason is not because of the tax rates, it's because many SMEs evade taxes. The reason is that tax rates are too high to them. So I fully agree with you that we should cut tax rates. But for any country, if you want to make income distribution more equal, cutting tax, I doubt will have an effect. Because when you cut tax, especially in China's case, companies do not distribute dividends very often. So which means if you cut tax, then those money will go to those capital owners. So in the end, you may have a worse income distribution. So in this case, I think working on tax rates is not going to be a good idea.
Well,
for
they would argue,
distribution.
just as everywhere in the world, cutting tax might be one of the ways to encourage the economy to grow and encourage more employment opportunities for businesses.
Well, that's true in general, but we have to solve the problem of stock. The stock actually has a huge problem, especially the government policy. Government gives a lot of subsidies through capital to those larger firms. Right? My own colleague in our center, Professor Huang Yiping, did a study on this, and his study shows that through the subsidies in the factor markets, the government gives capital owners a total subsidy of about 10% of GDP. Well, you can dispute on the exact number, but the quantity is a big number. I mean, just to think about the negative saving rates in China, right? So last year, the inflation rate was more than 4%, but the annual saving rate was a little bit over 2%.
And what does it mean?
That means people, ordinary depositors, are paying heavily inflation tax. I did a simple calculation that came up to 1.5 trillion RMB. That's a huge amount of money. So the government policies are transferring income from a household sector to the corporate sector.
And does cutting taxes, just once again for our viewers' sake, means cutting the taxes of enterprises or cutting the taxes, if there is a proposal, of individuals here in China? Because these two might be quite very different things.
Yeah, I actually believe in that. I think if we really want to have more equal income distribution, we should cut taxes on people, especially in the median range. And also, to a large extent, I would also say that we should cut the marginal tax rate on those high-income people, because that's very discouraging for them. Many of those top executives do not want to live in China. They rather live in Hong Kong, but then work in China, so they can evade the tax. So I think both. We should definitely cut the tax rates on middle class, but in the meantime, we may also need to think about cutting the marginal tax rate on those super rich.
But then here is really the dispute here. If you also, Professor Yao, as you argued, make sure that all of those high-level talents are coming back to China's mainland to work, then that probably means you need to not that much to increase at least their tax rate. But then in many cases, people would argue that is in a way increase the wealth gap in this society, which is already quite a big headache.
Well, I think the growing income inequality has been basically caused by two things. One is a rural-urban divide. So the urban income is much higher than rural income. Another factor is that the growth of income in the very top, like 1% or even 1 in 1,000. And
You're using the 1%, which of course is a very interesting phrase.
But those people are capital owners. They're not ordinary employees. They're not even top executive. Right? They own factories. Right? So if you just cut tax on those people, their income will increase. That's going to worsen income distribution.
You're making things very complicated already. Cutting tax for certain social groups, not for the others, but how to make sure we understand the definition of this social group and how individual would be categorized. That's a very interesting thing. You want to follow up on that, Professor Yao?
Well, I think
to make sure we understand
the
right?
major distinction here is whether you own capital, whether your capital makes money. I think that's the key here.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Mahone?
Yes, I do. I think it's a very good analysis. And the fact that we put a lot of effort into analysing the data, which is essentially rural compared to urban income, and yet it creates a false picture in some ways, because as long as income is improving in China and wealth, common wealth in general, is growing, the impact of a lot of these things is somewhat mitigated.
What do you mean by that?
As long as people are making more money every year, or every 3 or 4 years they see their lives improve, or their children's lives improve, the fact that others are wealthier than they are is not such a crucial factor. As long as that sense that there is the facility for upward mobility in the society, a lot has been already tolerated in the last 2 decades and will go on being so. But I think you're right, it's not just about tax. It's in the end about ongoing economic reform.
Well, that is also a very hard thing because, as you said, it's about whether people feel that their living standards or their lives have been improved compared to, let's say, 1 year or 2 years from now. But as both of you understand, gentlemen, China's GDP growth rate has really now stabilized around 7.5%, and it's around that being the target of the year. It is not the skyrocketing growth anymore. That is not going to be China in the next few years. So the feeling of your living standards being elevated year by year, is it still a possibility? And in order to create that satisfaction of the feeling that your life had been improved, what does it mean, or how much pressure does it mean to put on the China's distribution system, income distribution particularly? Is it ever a mission possible, Mr. Yao?
Well, I think the problem here is that the whole economy is going to grow by 7 to 8%. But because of the worsening income distribution, households' share of total GDP is actually declining. So using Mr. Maho's notion of relative income, then people are going to feel relatively poorer through time, right? Because their share in the whole economy is declining. So I think that's a very key here. If we really want to change the income distribution in China, we have to make people's income to grow as fast as the GDP grows.
We do to a point, but I think the trouble with the Chinese growth model has been, it's been so rapid, and the high rates of growth have been appropriate for a developing country. And I mean, in the end, we're still looking at a developing economy, and we cannot compare it to developed economies. So I think that it is a sense that, in a way, the economy has outgrown people's ability to keep up with it relatively. So therefore, compared to China's GDP growth overall, it looks like there's been a decline. But actually, I think it's a false picture, because if you look at it over, say, the next 5 years, and as we hope in this new administration there'll be new impetus and new drives in general economic reform, I think a lot of these things can be resolved. You mentioned the fact that the larger enterprises, particularly state-owned enterprises, are not paying back dividends. There is not a flow of dividends back into the society to the people that actually are the stakeholders in those enterprises. Those things can be corrected. And it's interesting how China has proven over and over again that when it faces something really difficult, the sort of sense of economic crisis or major political roadblocks, the party really applies itself and surprisingly gets things done. I mean, you will remember from the 90s, we were encouraged to write off the banks because they're insolvent, too many bad loans. Look at them now, they're in very, very good shape.
Or state-owned enterprises reform back in the 1990s also.
And then look at them, they're profitable, the state enterprises.
So your point is, Mr. Mahon?
These challenges that China faces in order to create more equal or more rational income distribution, given the stage that China's economy is at, is achievable. The government has proven it can take on such things and fix them. So I'm quite positive that the pragmatism of the government, I mean, they will apply themselves, although it is a very expensive and a very difficult task.
Well, of course, it is no secret anymore that there are many interest groups here in China that's been growing over the past few years and 1 decade. And therefore, whether the situation now can be comparable to the 1980s and 1990s is a big question mark. And of course, both of you are going to help me to handle that big question mark in the latter half of the program. We're going to continue our discussion right after this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Dialogue, and welcome back as well. With me in the studio, we have Professor Yao Yang, who is the director of the Economic Research Center at Peking University. We also have David Mahon, who is the chief representative of the Mahon China Investment Management. Welcome to the two of you. Well, gentlemen, earlier you helped us to understand what might be some of the most controversial points in the possible proposal of income distribution here in China, which is expected to come out within the year. One important thing that we haven't touched on earlier is the socio-political changes that has been going on here in China over the past few years. And certainly those, as both of you understand, is still going to have quite a big impact on whether this reform can be done well. One of it is the appearances and apparent growth of the interest groups. They're not necessarily a negative thing. However, they are playing a big part in the debate of all kinds of policies. This one certainly is going to be a big role. Professor Yao, your thoughts on the role of the interest groups and how they are likely to shape the road ahead?
Well, in China, there are many interest groups, but unlike in other countries, many of those interest groups are kind of undefined in China.
Quite fluid.
That's right. Think about the hukou reform, right? The government announced a new hukou policy in last February, but we haven't seen any concrete policies to implement this reform. There are news saying that the central government sent government officials down to the city, and none of the cities believe that this is a good policy. So you can see certainly there must be some interest groups behind that you cannot identify. But supposedly, if we carried out this reform, the rural-urban income gap will be much smaller. So you can feel it.
Well, Mr. Mahon, your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right. The interest groups are rather abstract, or it's difficult to define them. I think, though, there are some clear threads. One is that you have now an ability for people to communicate, share thoughts, receive information. That whole phenomenon is something which affects the whole world, but it's been a major impact on China. So the sense of social injustice, a sense of general fairness is something that has become a much more sensitive issue because people are much more informed. Then the government is also better informed about what people think because they are also participants in this whole social networking and social information change. So I think that we're in a very more complex time in terms of what people want, who they are and how to define them. Farmers that have their land inappropriately taken from them for industrial or residential development, now their voice is heard almost immediately. I think also there are issues where the government itself must be an example. And we've had some recent instances where some in the government have been inordinately rich, and there's been questions about how that occurred. So I think dealing with that is going to be one of the main signals that the government sends in order to get people's confidence in the process.
Can that be done, Professor Yao?
Well, certainly it can be done. You know, if the government wants to implement some policies, the government will do that. But my question is whether the government has the correct approach. For example, if
what is the correct approach, your version?
Well, the correct approach to me is first the government should slow down its income growth because the government's income is growing so fast. Currently, the government accounts for about 1/3 of China's GDP. That's very, very high, and it's still increasing. And second, the government should spend more on people, direct spending on people's welfare, education, especially education. Right? And thirdly, cut taxes on individuals.
Right. Well, those are great points, but we do understand, as you mentioned, the government here or the state plays a very big role here in China. And certainly over the past few decades since reform opening up, that role has been very positive. And this round of economic and financial crisis once again brought a lot of thoughts to Chinese that it might not be such a bad thing that the government is playing a big role. But then how to keep that balance? One is to give enough space to the market. On the other hand, the government should act in the areas it should. That is really a tricky question. Mr. Mahon, let me have your thoughts here. The government being both a benefiter of the current system and the dominant forces designing the future system, now in this case, income distribution reform, will it be able to, as Professor Yao expected earlier, to cut its share of the cake? And how much political and economic courage does it take?
Well, again, I know things in the past were different and sometimes simpler, but if you think of the principle of Zhurongji's time and the extraordinary changes that he brought about, and quite shocking to an economy that was unaccustomed to such an extraordinary short period of time and so much reform. China did it then because it had to. China must change what it's doing now. It must.
I have to mention here that period of reform was also painful, but
Very
at the
painful.
same time being done to a certain extent. So
That's true, and I think
That's once again, we're going back to the question, do we have both the political and economic courage, both from the government and the public, to do that again?
I think you do, because you have no other choice. I don't think the government has any illusions that it must undertake these reforms. If it doesn't, it'll have more problems than it currently faces. The problems it faces by cutting its own share of the pie, the problem it faces by creating a more transparent system and disenfranchising some of those associated with government who are inappropriately rich today, are far, far smaller than the problems that will come if they don't do it. And one thing about the Chinese Communist Party is that it has mutated really since the early days of reform in an extremely agile and flexible way. So right now, although it will be painful for all, it must be undertaken, and therefore, being pragmatic, I think that this government will undertake it.
Well, one of the reasons why it was being talked about back in the year 2004 and this year being strongly brought back again about this reform has something to do with the courage that you have been talking about. But Professor Yao, your thoughts here? What kind of challenge does it really mean?
Well, if we look at the recent Chinese history, you're going to find a kind of a political cycle of 10 years. So in the 90s, we had a lot of reforms, really hard reforms. In the 2000s, we were kind of enjoying the fruits of a current reform. But of course, the reform process has been slowed down. So then we end kind of another stage. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to move back a little bit toward the 1990s. Then I fully agree with...
Is that only your analysis, or you got the information that we don't know?
I think that this is pretty much kind of the logic of politics, right? You go to the right a little bit, then you go to the left, and then you go to the right. In the end, the country, in the long run, will walk in the middle. So I have confidence in the next administration to get things done.
Well, before we talk about any right or left, final word from both of you. What do you think it takes really to have this round of income distribution, very important here in China, this reform to be successful? Briefly. One sentence if you can.
Well, I think the government should find out the right approach. That's very key.
All right, Mr. Mahon?
It can only work in the context of all the other economic reforms that are now crucial for the government to initiate.
David Mahon, Yao Yang, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us for this round of discussion.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching on Tianwei in Beijing. Bye for now. Thank you, sir.
Scandals involving the children of the newly rich have created anger and controversy across the country. One example includes Guo Mei, who falsely claimed to work at the Chinese Red Cross and came under scrutiny after she posted pictures of her lavish lifestyle online. Over the past few decades, China's income gap between rich and poor has widened, creating fears that this wealth inequality could lead to social instability. The Gini coefficient is commonly used to measure income inequality. Anything above 0.4 is considered to be nearing worrying levels. And according to a CIA estimate from 1989 to 2009, China's figure climbed to nearly 0.5. The figure in Western developed countries hovers around 0.3. After 8 years in the works, the Chinese government is expected to launch income distribution reforms by the end of this year.
You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News, coming to you from Beijing. I'm your host, Tian Wei. A proposal designed to improve the distribution of incomes is expected to be unveiled at the end of this year. One of the key features will be an adjustment of primary distribution pattern, which is aimed at cutting taxes and encouraging enterprises to give more back to society in terms of financial resources. It will also encourage businesses to increase workers' salaries. So what are the highlights and the challenges of implementing the income redistribution reforms? How will they influence China's economic structure and future economic development? And likely going to be a proposal. If there is going to be a proposal, how much change of a picture really is it going to make to the distribution of income here in this country? Professor Yao.
Well, I think there are several factors currently that induce the government to do this this year or next year. One of the factors is the rising inequality in China. By the early 2000s, the inequality was high, but was not very bad. But today, if you look at the Gini coefficient, it's approaching 0.5, or even higher than that, some people say.
There is a standard of the Gini coefficient, which is how much, and what does it mean now for China?
I think a 0.4 can be a threshold. If it's below 0.4, then you would say, hey, this society is basically equal. But after...
Most importantly, will they achieve the goal of narrowing the widening wealth gap in China, something the Chinese government says is one of its top priorities? To discuss all of these questions and even more, we have Professor Yao Yang, Director of the Economic Research Center at Peking University. Welcome, sir. And also we're joined in the studio by David Mohammed. He is the Chief Representative of Mohammed China Investment Management. But before we go to a discussion, gentlemen, about this very, very important issue here in China, let's take a look at this background report.
China's microblogging community has been greatly concerned over the state of impoverished children across the country. Hunger, a lack of health care, education, and even proper clothing have left these young children with very few chances at having a normal, comfortable life. But on the other extreme, economists say they may include a series of measures, including tax cuts, requirements that companies reinvest their profits back into society, and raising workers' wages. But they warn that strong entrenched interests may hinder any far-reaching reforms. At the 18th CPC National Congress, pledges were made to double the country's per capita income by 2020. To realize this goal, experts say the country must find new development models that increase the livelihood of the average citizen. Income distribution reform is just the first step in a long journey to make China a more equal society.
Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
The reform has been discussed, or rather the possibility of reform has been discussed back in the year 2004. 8 years already gone by. Why now, eventually this year,